Wild seas and a rugged weather-beaten coastline typify an image of Shetland, the most northerly islands of Great Britain. From these tiny, remote islands, steeped in Nordic history and influences, has evolved a special tradition and skill in knitting. Through long, harsh winters, Shetland women developed intricate knitting patterns. Derived from the native sheep, finest wool blends are carded, spun and knitted into unique Shetland garments. Elizabeth Hawick, born in Lerwick, the capital of Shetland, in 1903, set sail for New Zealand some 25 years later. Bringing the Shetland heritage with her, Elizabeth has continued to practice its fascinating skills. Can you tell us, Elizabeth, some of your first memories of knitting in Shetland?
Just sitting on a little footstool at my mother's knee, knitting on 2 needles. Just getting to know how to knit.
And how old were you when you first started to knit?
Oh, long before I went to school.
And can you remember what you did knit at that age?
Well, the first thing I knitted to sell in the shops were baby mittens. My mother gave me a hank of Shetland wool, and I knitted 6 pairs of mittens like that from the one hank of wool. And I took it to the shop, and the woman said, "I'll give you 6pence a pair for them." And I said, "Thank you very much." That was 3 and 6pence. That would be 35 cents, wouldn't it now?
Yes.
For knitting 6 pair of mittens.
So in those days, knitting was for an economy, wasn't it?
It was. Women in Shetland had to knit because it was part of their livelihood. And the main folk went to the fishing.
Can you describe a little more of your earlier days in Shetland and the typical croft scene for the women folk?
Yes, well, the women folk had to do as much on the croft as the men. They had to do the digging, the weeding, and then when the crops were harvested, then they had to dig the potatoes, dig the turnips.
And when was it you left Shetland to come to New Zealand?
In 1930.
Mm-hmm.
And we never regretted it.
No.
It's the best country to live. And it was then, and to bring up children then.
Mm-hmm. And over the years you've become an expert at knitting, Fair patterns and lacy styles. Can you tell me of any of the origins of Fair Isle patterns?
Well, it was supposed to be from Fair Isle. A Spanish ship was wrecked on Fair Isle, and the men on the ship taught the women the Fair Isle patterns. And from the Fair Isle, it spread to Shetland.
Apparently in Shetland they never actually work from a pattern, do they?
No. I remember after I started to knit Fair Isle, there were most lovely patterns on the linoleum on the floor, and we used to dot the patterns out on a page of graph paper, and then we just added on to that.
Mm-hmm.
But after I finished knitting the baby mittens, then I graduated to women's plain gloves, and then after that, then I went to do Fair Isle gloves. And that's done in the Shetland natural colours, that one. Yes.
Can you tell us the names, particularly of the Shetland colours, the sheep? They had a particular name, didn't they?
They're white and murret. Murret is a brown shade, and black. Now, if you want it grey, a shade of grey, then you mix a certain amount of black and white. If you wanted a fawn shade, mix the brown, the murret shade with white, and you get it to any shade you want it.
And you've done quite a lot of Fair Isle pullovers as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the ones we've got in front here?
Well, this is the only one I've knitted in New Zealand, but it's knitted in New Zealand wool, and I don't think it'll ever wear out. My daughters wore it, the grandchildren wore it, and now I'm hoping some of the great-grandchildren will wear it. But that's the only one I've done in New Zealand. This one, and the mittens, and there was a beret that went with this, and that was, every stitch of that was hand-knitted in Shetland in 1950, and it belonged to my daughter June. It was given to her in a birthday present. And but nowadays, a lot of the Fair Island Shetland is done on the machine.
Like the one you're wearing. Can you tell us how that one's done?
Well, the body of it is done on the machine, but always the yoke is hand knitted, always. Yes.
So, as well as the Fair Isle, you've done a lot of lace knitting as well, haven't you? Now, with the lace knitting, you have to have a particular type of wool. Can you tell us how they derived this particular wool and what part of the sheep it came from?
Yes, for the one-ply wool to knit the very fine lace knitting that would go through a wedding ring, the wool is plucked from the underneath the chin of the sheep, because that's the finest wool. And the rest of the wool on the sheep is coarser, so that's made into rugs.
One of the traditional pieces of equipment for Shetland knitting is the knitting belt. How does it aid the knitter?
Well, it's made of leather, stuffed with horsehair, and we just stick the needle in the belt, and that holds the needle steady. And I think that's why so many Shetland women are such fast knitters.
It actually steadies the needle and you don't need to move it, do you?
No, don't have to move it.
And who would have made them in Shetland originally?
Always the shoemaker. And the first one I bought, I paid 1 6 for.
What's, Elizabeth, the advantage of using a knitting belt?
Well, you just stick the needle in there, and then I put my hand on here and just keep knitting. And if I have to put my hand down, well, the needle is still there, it doesn't run away, it doesn't slip out.
You've got it permanently held and you don't need to move it, do you?
No, I don't need to move it.
And that aids in the speed.
Yeah, and then you just put your needle in like that, put the wool over, put it down, flip it off. It's just so easy.
A real economy of movement, isn't it?
Yeah, there's hardly any movement.
Elizabeth, can we have a look at what you're doing here? Just to have a wee look of it out of the belt, perhaps.
Yes.
And what ply was this you were knitting again?
This is 2-ply.
2-ply.
Yes.
And can you show us these other examples you've got in front here and what they all involve?
This one will look the same as this one when this one is dressed. But that's the plain white. And then this is one just done in the 1-ply. And that's Shetland wool too.
That looks like the lacy cobweb effect they
Yes.
talk about.
Yes. This is the wool that can go through a wedding ring, a baby shawl.
Mm.
That's that. And this one, the wool was plucked from underneath the sheep's chin and hand carved it, hand teased, carved it and spun and hand knitted. And an old lady who did that for me was 86 years old. And I've had this for just on 70 years now.
Beautiful.
And I've worn it a lot.
And all the patterns are derived from nature and the sea.
Yes,
And they're all carried in the head.
yes. In the olden days when there were no pattern books, and the knitters carried the pattern in their head. And if any of them worked out a new open work pattern, they made sure that someone else learned it so that it would never be forgotten.
Now this one's just got a variation in colour, hasn't it, Elizabeth?
Yes, just the Shetland natural colours.
And the same pattern again.
Yes,
Now another essential with these is that they're dressed. Can you explain
Yes.
this to us?
well, when I've finished knitting them, then I stitch the sides together like that, and I wash them, and then
We've got an example here on
and
a board.
while they're wet, I slide them onto this board, and I lash the end of them over the board, and that brings out the peaks,
Mm-hmm.
and it shows up the pattern, but they must be done on the board. And it doesn't matter how many years old they are, when they're done on this board, they always come up like new. Yes.
And is it put on when it's damp, did you say?
It has to go on while it's damp, yes.
Mhm.
And pullovers and cardigans have their special board. With main socks, there's also a sock board for that.
Oh, yes.
So that's the sock board. You see the.
Mm-hmm. And it keeps it at its
Yes.
proper shape, doesn't it?
And I always knit the socks on 4 needles. Some people, they knit them on 2 and stitch them up to make a back seam on them. But no, this is the way that
And you'd have no seam in this sock,
no
would you?
seam, no. This is the way I did them when I was a child. And when we were young, at primary school, we had to knit our own socks. But I'm so slow now at knitting. I suppose I can blame age for that. Many Specks is the name of this poem. Their locks of things made no my Joe, fae the lacy scarf to the fair owl knit, their sombre bonnets and lumber jackets, and berries and jumpers, sma and grit. When I was young, folk rocht with spencers, and muckle-thick socks, and worsted slips. For by the haps, white, black and sheller, and some of them grey with murret strips. They would sit for hours at the fire sheik mackin, and bake on clods for a better light, and mak a sock as they carried the kishie, and gang wi' a sock about the night. When times was hard, in the days afore was, the folk was wont to row and hent, mak socks and sell them to the Dutchies, and that was the way that they paid the rent. It's a while for somebody started making a lang thick sock or a swatter jupe, and nae man kens the name of that maker, the een that was first to cast the loop. Whatever fan out the way to do it, her work was a blessing to all the folk, and we so truly rose, my jewel, the first een that ever laid up a sock.